Hi, Tony from It Talking Remote back again today. I've got a fantastic guest that we're going to be talking today. Marcus Braszell, how are you today?
Very well. Great to be here. Thanks, Tony.
Oh, fantastic to have you on. Listen, if you're watching the show, don't forget, like, subscribe, helps us keep it going. Join our newsletter, Teamcraft. You can find out all the details below, or join our community, remoteaf.co. Click the community button and join a community of like-minded people who are looking to improve work. We have lots of these conversations, much like we're going to have today. Enough of the advertising stuff. Marcus, fantastic to have you on. Be really good if you introduce yourself for everybody.
Will do. Thanks, Tony. So Marcus Braszell is my name. I'm based in Canada and I'm a partner and America's leader for a company called Sooner, Safer, Happier. We are a company which is community-led. We consider ourselves a movement, and we're in the kind of post-framework type of world when it comes to new ways of working. And we help companies build better outcomes over outputs, and we're ultimately helping to build a more humane way of working. So yeah, it's great to be talking to you on this podcast. And should I say, Tony, big fan of the work you've been doing with remote agile framework, the Talking Remote, and also I've been following your work in relation to the agile revolution with you and Craig. So yeah, huge contribution you've been making to the community as well. So big thanks for that.
Thanks, Marcus. And I think that one of the reasons that I wanted to get you on is because we've been traveling sort of parallel universes, the way I look at it. And Sooner, Safer, Happier. We see not as a competitor, but someone who's trying to do the same kind of things that we're trying to do in organisations. So I think it's a really poignant conversation. In saying that, talk to me a little bit about Sooner, Safer, Happier, because it's not a framework; it's really a community. So it'd be interesting for people to hear a little bit more about it.
That's right. Well, the book came out in 2019, written by John Smart, Miles Ogilvy, and Jolt. And the book is really built out of a set of lessons learned from trying to incubate better ways of working in large organizations. And it's built through, a lot of lessons, a lot of failures around incubating new ways of working. And, better, value, sooner, safer, happier is the construct. In essence, what we're trying to do is support ways of working through an outcomes lens, not through a framework lens. That's the way I describe it. So the book is actually a collection. The book Sooner, Safer, Happier, which you can see behind me, is actually a collection of patterns and anti-patterns for business agility. So things that we've learned over the years to be either tailwinds or headwinds when it comes to business agility.
It's always good to have the strategically placed product. Well done.
Thanks.
Lovely. So when we were talking, I often chat to my guests off air. When we were talking off air, we were talking about organisational constructs and see how we see the movement of agility has ignored a bunch of things for a very long time, I feel. And now we're starting to see that come back to haunt us. And one of those is you and I are talking about is governing the system of work in total. I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on what you're seeing in organisations as you work with them.
Yeah, exactly. Like over many years, I've been talking about business agility or agile, and that conversation shifted for me now. So what I'm talking about a lot these days is strategy to execution. So what is a system of work that creates outcomes within a company from an idea to being in market? And how does that work, and what are the key elements that need to be in place for that to operate with flow, deliver great outcomes, to have a better experience for employees in the company and customers as well. And so I think, we need to be addressing like a number of the key pillars in order to create an effective end-to-end strategy execution ecosystem. So some of those things would be things like portfolio governance. So what are the stage gates and how do we manage the portfolio? What's the operating model? How are we structured? Are we in functional silos or are we in value streams? The portfolio management tooling, ways of working, and also how we think about outcomes, and we think about OKRs. We talk about OKRs a lot. So for me, the 5 key things, and I think they're empowered by things like leadership and culture, and also the incentive model. What incentive do people have to improve ways of working, etc.
And I think the problem for us, when I say us as a community, right, organisationally, when we see these organisations, they've focused on the process and the practices and affected their flow of work ostensibly because that's where the easiest part generally is to design into an organization, right? But the rest of it hasn't been looked at. And as you said, you often see the strategic intent. They usually know what the strategy is, but how do you link that to delivery and delivery back? But the big piece for me is the funding and how you govern the system, and not just PMOs and projects, but as an entirety. That's the piece that we're seeing that now is hampering, because you can only be as agile and as speedy as your fastest leg. And you were saying you're seeing that a lot.
Yeah. So it's funny when you actually look at how execution works on an end-to-end basis. And one of the things that we do initially is value stream mapping to determine that. And what it often surfaces up is a surprising number of handoffs and kind of fractured processes in the delivery value. And we kind of need to ask ourselves, why is that? How's that come to be? And for me, particularly in knowledge work, a lot of that work is actually not tangible or visible to the eye. And so the processes that have been put in place over many years, and I often call it a patchwork quilt, it's kind of layered complexity that's been built up over a number of years. And a lot of these execution systems, when you come into a company, they're not built for speed or flow or even outcomes. In fact, the number of the processes and checklists you see are actually a result of potential shocks to the system. Could have been some compliance issues, etc. So that layered complexity is actually there, and that needs constant paying down. It's almost a complexity that accumulates over time, and that needs to be addressed. But there are not many people who have a role where they are actually responsible for the end-to-end execution of value, right? Yeah. It's usually a culmination of different functions that operate within that, and each one is trying to locally optimize, right? But lots of local optimizations does not create an optimal system of work.
And that's what we see. It's not been designed. It's not been designed with the contextual of the organisation and to address those things. And as we were talking about, I call that a complexity tax. They're paying the complexity tax of time, people, money, all of those things that we know that affect the organisation. Interestingly enough, you were talking about that hidden work, and you were talking about you map that flow, because as you said, these organisations have grown, and they've grown over a period of time, and no one actually really understands them. You had some good experiences with that as we were chatting.
Yeah, exactly. And knowledge work, it's not like a factory, for example. So if you walked into a factory, you could see the factory floor. You can see the work, the inventory, the workers. And when you're in knowledge work, and I do work here in North America with a number of Silicon Valley companies, no one really sees that end to end, because you can't. And so some of the analogies that I do use, for example, imagine if this was an actual factory that you are operating in. What would it look like? Are people duplicating their work? Is the factory floor dirty? Is the work piling up? Do we see rework? Okay. And in some of the companies I operate in, the actual time it takes to go from an idea into your market can be a year. It can be a couple of years. There can be hundreds of handoffs in how that works. And there can be tens and tens of different functional units the work actually crosses over. And so I think it's important to sort of map that out, value stream map that, and use that as basically a device to help educate people that this is actually the system of work that you have. This is how it's working now. So that's the awareness part, I think, is part of the change process there. And then from that, you can make incremental adjustments to improving that system of work, and they should be measured. So, for example, we talk about sooner in BVSSH. We don't talk about faster, we talk about sooner. And that's ultimately about time to learning. So that's things like lead time, cycle time, and flow efficiency. And like in most companies, the flow efficiency is around about 10%. What does that mean? Well, it means 90% of the time the work is actually waiting. So if you can take that value stream map, apply some metrics to it, then you can start to actually quantify and use it as an education mechanism with senior folks to start getting the permission to start making some changes to that.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because the golden nugget or the golden leaf held out to executives and leaders for so very long by the agilists and agile community is it's faster. And I like the fact that you're talking about sooner, delivering value sooner. because you can have speed to market but be delivering absolute rubbish, right? Which is, intent what's happened over the periods of time because we haven't addressed some of those things. So I really like that focus that you have there. I see a great comment there. Young Luke, where we know well, fractured organisations equals fractured CX. What's your thoughts on that, Marcus?
Oh, 100% agree. We often what we call ship our org chart. Underpinning that are things like Conway's law. But if we have different functional silos producing customer experiences, where we often see the experience gap is between those functions, right? So we often, ship our org chart in terms of the customer experience that we're looking at. So, when we're thinking about the operating model, we need to think about what is the end-to-end blueprint for the customer experience. We need to think about what are the multidisciplinary teams that can underpin that flow of value. And we often talk about this concept of value streams, moving from functional silos in the organizational operating model to value streams. And there's a few key elements that need to be in a value stream for it to be effective. I'm happy to talk about some of those if we get time.
Yeah, no, we will. We'll tackle some of those because, that flow, the instance of flow and that fractured or siloed, silos become chasms, as we always say, is super important in an organisation. I call them arthritic organisations, actually, because they've got to a point of arthritis where they can't move, and unless you do something about that, then you're never going to get that fluidity back that you had as your organisation started. So, interestingly enough, though, you don't just look at it in terms of, you're looking at the funding and the governance, right, of the portfolio. Talk to me a little bit about your experiences with that.
Yeah, so I've worked in many companies. I've actually been fortunate enough to be on both sides of the fence in terms of consulting, but also an internal incumbent, incubating change towards business agility in some very large companies. What we often see is there'll be a traditional PMO in place. There'll be traditional forms of work governance, so stage gates, toll gates, these sorts of things. A lot of mechanisms built to really slow down work. And the funding model is one of those, right? And so the funding model or business cases are used as a mechanism to prove ROI. And that often leads to big upfront design, right? Requirements, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the really key levers for speed is the funding model. And I'm a big fan of capacity-based funding model, or funding a collection of people which are aligned to the value consumer and aligned to the flow of value in the company. So you can have a consumer value being an internal or an external, but there needs to be something that the company is producing of value. And that can be a product, it can be other sorts of things. But I like the idea of funding that type of mechanism rather than funding projects, because funding projects is a fairly long form and fairly big upfront way of thinking about executing change inside the company. And so for me, I'm a big fan of books like, Project to Product from Mick Kirsten, and trying to move towards, product teams from project teams. And so the funding mechanisms is a really key lever in that.
So let me ask you a little bit about that, because it's a question I get asked a lot when I go into organisations, right? And, a lot of the organisations have been around for some time. We'll talk about it. And they have that, you talked about it before, that layered complexity, organisational detritus, everything's been piled on, nothing's been taken away. One of those with funding, though, is that a lot of organisations are stuck in the annual funding cycle or the quarterly. How do you turn? What's your thoughts on how you turn that ship around to capacity-based funding? Because that's a big jump for a lot of organisations, particularly those that are governed by regulatory situations as well. And I'm interested to hear your experiences with that, Marcus.
Yeah, I think the annual funding cycle is a very difficult one to break, because ultimately companies do have a budget and they are trying to hit that budget each year. Okay, so the beyond budgeting movement, moving to rolling budgeting, I think is a way of thinking about that. Funding rather than a full year and then set and forget, maybe funding a quarter and tying that very closely to something like OKRs.
Yeah,
I've had some success with that. So what we're trying to manage there is outcomes rather than outputs, right? So we're not managing the projects and the milestones and the RAGs. We're actually trying to measure, what are the key metrics we're trying to shift in the organization. So yes, we're spending money quarter by quarter on teams of teams. So that's the burn rate. But where the transparency comes in is through the outcomes and how we're tracking to those. So for example, each quarter we shift the needle on, NPS or customer satisfaction, looking at leading and lagging indicators. That to me should be the primary form of governance when we talk about, are we getting a return for our investment? So, and I think you can still do that even within a traditional yearly funding cycle, but you can create a more incremental method of actually measuring that outcome as you go through the year.
Yeah, the other thing I see there, when you sort of shift that around to bucket funding, whatever you want to call that, is often that gets put in place. You can get that turned to that, but then what happens is it's the governance that goes with the funding that actually chokes the daylights out of it, right? Because they continue to, you're going to put a brief in to get your money, or you've got to do X, or you've got to, and moving them to that more transparent factor of allowing the group that you've funded that bucket to manage it, but report back on it incrementally, rather than being in the actual execution of it, I suppose is the word. And are you seeing that? Have you had experience with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what moves you away from that big upfront requirements to get the business case designed is actually moving to long-lived teams, to be honest. I think once you're in the kind of capacity funded world, we're all aligned in multidisciplinary teams now within a value stream, working towards a clear consumer of that value. That's now funded. But what we're keeping them accountable on is the outcomes. So I think a road to get to that, to break that large upfront funding cycle, is actually to change the operating model and how we're actually organizing ourselves. So again, the shift from functional silos and projects as the main way of delivering value to long-lived cross-functional multidisciplinary teams aligned to value streams. Now that's a very different way of thinking about the execution of value inside a company.
Yeah.
And that can be a long way to get there. And in terms of how to get there, we talk to, think big, start small, learn fast. So we often talk to, let's create one value stream. Let's see how that performs. Let's see if it's getting better outcomes before we start to scale that up and build more value streams inside the company. So I think that's an important part too of creating trust and bringing the executive leadership team on the journey too, is to prove it first, prove that this idea works. Yeah.
And I think that operating model is an interesting thing, because operating model design, people often enter into that. And when they talk about operating model design, what they're really talking about is, as I said before, adjusting or transitioning their flow of work. But again, as we were talking about, it's a holistic change. It's about how you link your strategic intent to your delivery, your governing systems, and your funding. You have to address them all at the same time. Because if you just touch that layer, it's going to put pressure on those layers, and then you're going to be banging your head on the ceilings. And companies are ending up, we want to call that 3-speed economy, right? You got delivery going that way, you've got your funding and governing going that way, and you might have your strategic intent going that way. Off air, we were chatting about that in single demand view, and people being able to understand where all the work is coming in. You were saying to me that you don't see that a lot in organizations.
Yeah, I'll come back to the operating model piece as well, because I think that's really interesting what you're saying there. But you're right, the single view of demand, the golden thread from strategy to execution. Very few companies have this in place, and I think part of it is actually a tooling issue too, right? For example, so how many project management tools are being used by teams, or how many portfolio management tools are out there, and do they talk to one another, and are they connected? So asking a simple question like, what's everybody working on, and are they working on the right priorities, becomes a really tough manual question to have answered. So I do think there needs to be some level of standardization on team level tooling and portfolio tooling to be able to create that. But ultimately be able to we're heading towards a point where we can say, okay, what is the stack rank of the portfolio? Are we all working on the right things? And behind that is, we want to put more wood behind fewer arrows, right? So we're going to be more focused on the key priorities and the things that are going to make a big difference, for the company. So that's actually quite a rare situation where companies do have that golden thread and do have that uniformity in their portfolio stack and be able to see that single source of truth for the work.
Yeah, but I think if you're going to attempt operating model design, change your portfolio, any of that kind of thing, single demand view is where I start with in portfolios. You have to be able to see the flow of work, right? And that comes down to we'll go back to the operating model piece. The reason I link those two together is you have to design your patterns of work to enable the flow of information to allow you to actually see your work, right? Because old organizations, the donut economy runs deep, right? So you don't know where the work's coming from. Talk to me a little bit about your approach to the the operating model design, Marcus.
Yeah, so I think the classic mistake around operating model design is people think it's only structure, org structure. Okay, but there's a lot more that goes into an operating model design. So there's the service design, there's the portfolio governance, there's how we're going to fund the operating model, there's the technology stack, a few other things. And I think we need to approach operating model design from a pretty holistic and comprehensive basis. Okay, again, that's very hard to do system-wide. Start small would be the way to do that. So, for example, if we have an end-to-end team, we want to make sure that it has the applications that it needs to work on embedded, to try and break dependencies rather than manage them. So I think approaching the operating model design holistically is the best way to think about it. So because what we've often been doing or seeing is like we might change the team level, right? So we're now in cross-functional agile teams, but then we haven't adjusted the portfolio mechanism. Okay, yeah. So we've only been able to get so far with execution improvements. So we need to be almost like a thin slice right throughout the organization, adapting that in order to create better outcomes and faster outcomes or sooner outcomes as well.
And I think in that adaptation, so the way I talk about it is like you got a river flowing really hard, and you've got your boat with the sail up. How do sailors get through that? And they tack, right? They don't just go straight into it because it's a bad result. They're going to end up back here somewhere, right? And I see organizations just rush into it headlong, and then they hit the wall. Whereas if you take those small tacks, those incremental little shifts, so that you can see the information flow back to you, and it's that typical probe, sense, and response. So that's why I like the approach that you're talking about. Talk to me a little bit.
And I was going to say, you've got a great term here too, Tony, adaptive governance. So we want our governance model to be dynamic, but when we're thinking about adjusting it and tuning it, we want to do that incrementally as well. So, governance can go backwards pretty quickly inside of a company. More complexity can get added, but we need to constantly think about improving that and improving the flow of value. And we should consider that to be part of really all of our work, is improving the system of work and how work actually, executes through the end-to-end system.
Yeah, and I think we have to be pragmatic about that. Governance has been built on. And you and I talked about that again. We were talking about that earlier on. It becomes onerous. And if you make it complex and onerous, then governance becomes, or governing of the system becomes something people don't want to do, and they find ways around it, and then you end up with complexity again.
Yeah, so governance is also a service inside the company. And what's the service experience of governance? So if you find people who are diverting and don't want to do the governance steps, then I think a question might need to be asked: how's it been designed, and what's the experience of interacting with that? And if you are in a functionally siloed organization, these units might be locally optimizing the experience to suit them, but not to suit the end-to-end experience for the requester. Yeah. So compliance or risk teams might be a way of doing that. You can often see loads of risk teams inside like a big bank or a company like that, each with its own intake process. But the person who's trying to engage with that has to engage with every single intake process. So the end-to-end experience is quite poor from a requester point of view. So I think that's an interesting lens, just to bring in the experience lens to the governance process, and try to create experiences for governance that people actually want to engage with or be as part of their job, not something to skip or on top of their regular job.
Yeah, I like that. And I always talk about governance and governing the system. It has to be part of your everyday flow of work. It can't be that gated piece where everybody goes, oh, we've got to do that now. It should be part of the flow of work. We've talked about that in agility for a long time, but I think I'm going to be really controversial now. Okay, I'm going to say that a lot of agilists that I've experienced over the years have been afraid of governance, or they don't like governance. And I've actually heard people say, oh, we don't need governance. That's just slowing and choking the system down. But the problem with it is it's it's not good governance not built into the flow. It's governance that's been built to choke. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I largely agree with your controversial position there. To me, we shouldn't view governance as like a bad thing to be avoided, or we don't want to engage in it, because ultimately companies want to have governance in place. For me, it's about feedback loops. So a concept I've been working with for a few years is how many feedback loops and what is the speed of the feedback loops that your current governance process is allowing for. And let's say you're a traditional company, it takes you a year to get through your governance process. Maybe you've got 5 stage gates before you get to deliver your value. Call that one feedback loop. So if you're trying to incrementally adjust that and make it better, can you create 2 feedback loops in that process? Can you create a system where you can do a prototype or an experiment or an early design to get an early feedback loop before you go and embed and scale that? And in that system, maybe you haven't totally transformed the end-to-end, but you've created some level of adaptation. You've now got 2 feedback loops in your end-to-end governance process. So yeah, I think that's something that we should, as Agilists, absolutely be leaning into and consider that part of, if we're trying to create more agility in the system, we need to create more feedback loops in the governance process.
And if we want true business agility, we have to embrace that. Let's be really honest, right? There are organizations who have nearly lost their organizations because they ignore their governing systems. So the reality is, how do we allow them and enable them to still fulfill that, and being adaptive governance and being able to, make those changes and small pivots, no regrets, no surprises, early warning. Because nobody I've ever heard, or any executive I've ever talked to has complained about that, right? So there's a really good
exactly. There's actually, just on it, there's actually a really good risk perspective on that, right? Because ultimately we're trying to build the right thing before we build the thing right. So from a finance or a risk point of view, it's less risky to build the right thing. So what you want to do, you want to learn early whether you're building the right thing or not. So I think if you build the governance system correctly, you can actually bring in finance and risk and other sorts of stakeholders that might traditionally be like, okay, what's the ROI? What is this? And traditionally that's been driving big upfront designs.
Yeah.
But I think a more adaptive governance process actually reduces risk for the company. Yeah.
I love that. I'm going to circle back to that because there's a couple of things I want to dig deeper on that. But I just want to catch this before we lose it, because there's a few comments flying around. Luke's got a great question there. What's your thoughts on that, Marcus?
Well, I did mention before that ultimately we're trying to break dependencies rather than manage them. So, can we create a situation where teams can work together without having to have dependencies on each other? However, that isn't always the case, right? We can't have that perfect outcome every single time. So one way to help with that is to visualize work between areas and have some sort of agreement between those areas that they can visualize their work and interact with each other. Kanban might be a way of doing that from a work process point of view. But yeah, just think differently around how teams interact with each other, what the local optimization is. What are the processes to interact with each other? Can they be streamlined, for example? Can we work from a single source of truth, for example? Can we be pulling from a common backlog, for example? Right, if there's different teams. There's many ways to approach that in terms of reducing the dependencies between teams. But I think ultimately the best way to break them is to bring teams together.
When I hear the word "can't break them," that always worries me, because that tells me that it's an organizational construct where people have said, well, this is just the way we always do it, right? And it's a hard conversation to have because of those dependencies. And even if you want to try and pull them together, there'll be that pushback against it. So my answer to you, Luke, have you measured the cost of the dependencies? Have you measured the amount of time that those dependencies take from the system to enable you to deliver value? Because when you start measuring those and you start showing the value that they're actually stopping from being delivered, that's that complexity tax I was talking about before. And that's a conversation that you can then have with the people that you need to have about how you attend to that. So it might take you a little while, but I'm telling you now that if you can measure those things, the costs, the time, and the effect on it, you'll actually have a better conversation. I want to circle back. Marcus, because we're in the middle of the risk and stuff when that question came through. I didn't want to let it slide by too far. And I think you're right. So you're talking about risk. You're talking about funding. They're inextricably linked, right? I've never met any kind of CFO who didn't want to not spend money if he didn't have to. And, you look at organizations, they might fund $50 million, but then everybody's got to spend the $50 million, right? But part of the sooner, safer, happier, and better value gig that I see from you is that you're talking about, we're trying to deliver the value. Do we need to spend all that money, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, in a system where you have long pole projects that take a long time, most people in that system want to make sure they get all their features built in, right? Because things take a long time. So up front, they're saying, I need all these features. And what that often ends up in us building features that customers don't want. So we often talk about this concept of trimming the tail, right? So do we actually need that extra feature to be built in the first place? So there's quite a lot of wasted features, that get built. If you can test and learn and build things and put them to market in small incremental areas, get them to market sooner, then you can get that feedback loop earlier. And therefore you can figure out if you actually need to make the incremental cost of building the extra feature. And, you want to design all your mechanisms around that to be able to create that way of working.
Yeah. I think Pat Reed, who had a big effect on me, the wonderful Pat Reed, adaptive portfolio, adaptive governance lady, and many other things, Pat, I'm not really sure. Shout out to you. Had a profound effect on me because she made a statement once, and I've never let it go, which is minimum viable everything. And so when we talk about designing these systems, we design what we've been talking about today. It's minimum viable everything. It's not, we often see maximum viable product, right? Or maximum volume product, but it's minimum viable everything in terms of everything we're trying to design within the governing systems of the organizational construct. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I really like the idea of minimum viable governance, minimum viable compliance, and ultimately minimum viable bureaucracy inside the company. And again, a lot of the governance processes that we see have not really been consciously designed for things like flow or outcomes. They've been laid up over time, become more and more complex. But I think we need to take a step back when designing them and consciously design them for flow and speed. And what's the minimum set of guardrails that we need to keep people aligned and connected, and make sure we're working on the right things and the right priorities, and no more. That to me would be the minimum part of that. But again, it comes back to, I think a lot of this has been driven by that independent local optimization type of thinking that no one really sees it end to end, and people are doing their best with all the right intent. But ultimately, when you add that up, it does start to slow a company down. You end up with what you say, is the complexity tax.
And the interesting thing about that too, when we were having a chat as well, was it's not just enterprise or it's not just established enterprise. You see this, you said to me, you're seeing this in Silicon Valley with the startup to scale up. And the conversation I was having with you around that is well, yeah, I get that, because, when you're in startup and scale up, remote F, for example, right, it's very organic growth, and you're doing things that you wouldn't normally do. You're in that mission team status, right, where you just got a goal, you're going to do what you need to do to get there. But then you actually start to scale up, and you have to bring it into that kind of operational and product type team mechanism. And unless you stop and consciously design it, it's just going to organically grow and not be designed. And you said to me, you're seeing a lot of that?
Yeah, like even in some large Silicon Valley companies that have grown from a startup, very small scale, to even, globally sized, that startup nature is still in their DNA, right? And so they've done everything they can to make an outcome happen. So, they haven't had time to invest in things like OKRs or a strategic portfolio management system, or to fine tune the operating model for end-to-end flow. They've just been doing their best to keep up with the demand, right? So, and as they've grown and scaled, so too have the problems. So yeah, it's again taking a step back and trying to consciously design that strategy execution system for the best possible outcomes in the soonest possible way. And so, part of that is to think about, okay, what is the end-to-end governance process? What is the operating model? What's the tooling? How we're thinking about OKRs and aligning people around outcomes. And importantly, within that, ways of working in improving how we work in terms of practices, processes, methodologies, etc. And in fact, one of the survey questions that we ask when we do diagnosis around ways of working is, are leaders role modeling improving ways of working? And if you've come from a startup sort of culture, you don't have time to sit down and improve ways of working, right? It's been just features, just get the outcomes. So I think that's actually a behavioral trait that leaders need to build is, are we actually role modeling improving ways of working? In fact, in our survey, one of the lowest ones is typically, are our leaders improving or role modeling improving ways of working? Is that part of what they do or think about day to day? But if you could have that in place and leaders are role modeling improving ways of working, then you can start to arrest some of that detritus or some of that complexity or some of that atrophy that you're seeing in your system of work.
Yeah, it's an interesting. So leaders is one that people don't address quite often, and they have a big part in leading change. I was talking to a whole group of leaders about that yesterday. Part of the leadership is they're stuck in execution, right? They're busy with so much of the execution that actually leading the change is the piece that gets left behind, and they and talking about consciously refocusing on it, because how they lead the change affects the organizational construct. So I like the fact that you brought that up. Marcus,
leaders make or break it.
Yeah, nice. Yeah. Very true. It's so true, isn't it? And we hear that a bad leader or an organization with so many situations, but I think sometimes in the whole of this thing, leaders get a bad rap. Maybe they're not bad leaders when you actually start digging in deeper. I've seen that they're in a bad system, or they're so constricted by the system that they haven't been able to lead, and that makes things happen that sometimes is detrimental both to the people under them and the people around them and to themselves, right? So it goes back again to this construct of organising the system. I want to take you just right back to the beginning a tad, to one thing that you said, dig a little bit deeper on that before we go. You said that it's not a framework, it's a community. So I just wanted to touch on that. Everybody's going to be thinking, well, what's this community? Where can we get involved? And all these sorts of things around it. Talk to me about the communities that are available in this.
Absolutely. So we run 3 meetup communities globally. So we have one in EMEA, one in Asia Pacific, and one in the Americas as well. And through our meetups, we also have Slack channels for those forums, but that's the best way to engage with the Sooner Safer Happier community. And that's free and open for everybody to attend and to participate in. So we have really vibrant Slack channels where people are asking each other all sorts of questions around how to improve ways of working in my company. And there are lots and lots of people supporting one another through that, because that's ultimately what we're trying to do. We're trying to create a more humane world of working for people, where they can, be psychologically safe and where they can do their best work. So there's a great way of engaging with us. We also have a YouTube channel. I think there's over 60 or 70 videos in there now where you can hear from some great thought leaders. For example, we've got Jeff Gotholf coming up just next week.
Oh, Jeff,
talk about OKRs.
Good friend of the show. Good friend of the show. Say hi to him for me.
I think we'll do it. I have seen him on all the remote things. So, yeah, exactly. So we do a lot of case studies as well. So we talk about how companies have actually improved their ways of working. And I was actually part of a case study at Airbnb, and we presented that at the DevOps Enterprise Summit in 2022. And people can go online and talk about how we've been improving ways of working and what are the case studies. And for us, that's just sharing the learnings with all of our community. So that's, plenty of ways to get involved and become part of the movement.
That's fantastic. So look, we're right at the end of our time. So the other thing for me is, how can people get in touch with you? How can they engage with you personally, if not that, just the community itself, Marcus?
Well, I'd love to talk more. People can reach out to me on LinkedIn, Marcus Braszell at LinkedIn. That's probably the best way to get in touch. Yep.
Absolutely brilliant. Look, it's been fantastic having you on at Talking Remote today. We could literally, I say this to a number of my guests, but we literally could go on forever on this because we're so passionate about these systems of work. If you're watching the show, please like, subscribe. Don't forget, join our newsletter, Team Craft. That's in the show notes, and of course, remoteaf.co. Click the community button and join our community as well. So it's a great community that's very symbiotic with the safer, happier people as well. So we'd love to have you. Marcus Braszell, it's been fantastic having you on at Talking Remote today. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Tony. Great to be here. Thanks for the opportunity.